Alright, welcome back team. This is my second video on my progress on developing a game in Unity. And just like my first video, I've made some progress and I'm keen to share it. Now just to recap, the kind of game that I'm trying to make is a cross between Tunic and Dungeon Defenders, an action tower defense game where I can run around and attack, as well as place towers in an effort to defend Home Crystal. Now since my previous video I've made a little bit of progress, not a whole lot, but some that I'd like to share, and I've also started to implement some of the bigger game systems into it, like tower placement. If you want to check out my previous video, you can click the link in the top right corner. Otherwise, let's just get into it. So in my last video I ended up having a controllable character that could attack, a simple enemy that targets a base crystal that uses NavMesh navigation, and I set up a damage and health system, as well as some game over and menu functionality. Now starting off, my goals for this video was to implement a second enemy type, one that would both target the player and the crystal. I wanted to fix my player movement as I wasn't really happy with how it was feeling. And I wanted to start implementing some of the tower placement mechanics to get this game feeling more like a tower defense game rather than just a defense game. Starting out, I wanted to fix the player movement first, as I thought it'd be the easiest thing to get back into the swing of things. The biggest issue I had with the movement was that the player didn't instantly change directions when turning 180 degrees. Instead, it kind of went through this arc rather than pivoting on the spot, which would be annoying if you're walking along an edge and instead of turning 180 degrees, you do this arc and fall off. And so instead I created this snap to new direction boolean where the player's input magnitude hits 0, so for example when I stop or change directions, snap to new direction is positive, and then that triggers the next input direction to be the new orientation of my player, as opposed to using a quaternion to rotate, which was what was causing that arc. It's still not perfect, but I feel like it's a lot better than what it was. And as a way of celebrating getting back into game dev, I implemented this dance animation when the player wins. I really want to do some custom dance animations and add it to the game. I think it'd be really funny, and animation is something that I want to dabble in. I mean, I just picture like a group of enemies dancing like this as they approach the home crystal or something like that. But following the rules set in my first video, I promised I wouldn't get distracted by all that aesthetic stuff. With that sorted out, the next step was to implement a new enemy type. I wanted to test myself and make sort of like a short-ranged enemy. So I found this ghost guy on a free asset pack that I've linked in the description.
Oh, shiver my timbers!
And I had the idea that it would do some sort of close-range shout attack. And then maybe I could set that up with some particle systems or something like that. So the first thing I did was set up movement animations, setting up the NavMesh agent, and I also had another attempt at trying to implement a state machine, but again, like my first video, I just couldn't get these states to transition properly. For some reason, it would go to patrol and chase properly, whereby if the player moved into the detection range, it would swap targets and chase the player, but when the enemy got close enough to the player, instead of transitioning to the attack state where it was supposed to stop and do this shout attack, it would just continue running into the player or the crystal or whatever, but also attack at the same time. So I just kept it simple and only had a patrol and a chase state, and then just kept all the attack functionality within that chase state. And similar to my first video, I actually learned a lot about how Unity works by implementing this second enemy type. It really exposed me to the steps of Unity problem solving, where it's not so much implementing a big feature, rather it's implementing small steps to build that feature. Let me explain. The first thing I did with setting up my enemy was giving it a detection range, so when the player enters, the enemy swaps targets from the base crystal to the player, and then once the enemy gets close enough to the player, it enters the attack range, which then triggers the enemy to attack. Well, first things first, the enemy doesn't stop when it attacks, it just keeps running into my player or keeps running into the crystal, so when the player enters the enemy attack range, I just disable the enemy's NavMesh agent to stop movement when the enemy is attacking. Well, what happens when the enemy stops to attack and then the player moves out of the attack range? Well, I'll tell you, the ghost just seems to moonwalk after the player as the movement gets reset back to chasing, and because the enemy attack radius is a 360 degree circle, it attacks irrespective of the way it's facing, because it only knows to attack when the player enters the attack radius. Okay, so I set up a sort of attack cone in front of the enemy that the player needs to enter in order for the enemy to trigger an attack. But then the enemy doesn't turn to face the player when it gets close, because I haven't implemented a proper rotation function, it's just the NavMesh agent directing the enemy to the player. Okay, so I crank up the rotation speed to fix the enemy drifting towards the player, which makes it look a bit better, and I implement a pause mechanic where the enemy's movement is disabled for a moment before initiating attack, and then using coroutines will then wait for a second after attacking, and then allow the enemy to move again. Okay, great, so the enemy now rotates faster when chasing the player, but it still doesn't know how to rotate when the player is within the attack radius. Okay, so let's implement a rotation system when the enemy is stopped as well, so that the enemy will track the player when the player is within the enemy's attack radius. It's all of these micro steps that I didn't really think of when initially setting up this enemy. And then after all this refining and code writing, I added animations and wound up with an enemy that will stop when the player gets close enough, rotate to face the player, attack when it's in its side cone, and chase the player when it runs away. From here, I then tried to set up a particle system for the enemy to attack with. I wanted to kind of like scream out like a vortex looking thing, but I couldn't find any pre-made assets like that, so I decided to just try and make it shoot out bullets like a shotgun blast. I did set up a particle system that looked kinda shit but did the job, and then I added damage, but I couldn't figure out how to make the particle system just do a flat amount of damage. Instead, each individual particle would trigger its own separate damage, so that if one particle hit, it would do the correct amount of damage, but then if more than one hit, it would stack and just one-shot the player. Eventually I was like, why am I making this so much more difficult to myself? So I just replaced the particle system with this block game object that looks kinda shitty but does the job. I finished up with adding some damage and voila. I now have two enemy types, these trash mobs that hunt the crystal and these ghost boys that will attack the player when it gets too close. And so finally, it's time to implement my turret spawning system. The first thing I did was whip up a simple turret model in Unity, gave it some color, and then following Bracky's YouTube tutorial, I created a turret controller script and set up enemy targeting and tracking. I created a bullet and set up some shooting logic, and then added the damage logic so that the turrets can actually hurt enemies. Now in terms of the actual turret spawning, essentially what I wanted to happen was I would press a build button of some sort and then a placement circle would open up, and then I'd have like a little ghost turret floating around that would indicate where I can place, click, and then it instantiates the actual turret. And so the first thing I did was create a duplicate of my tower, title it Ghost Tower, and then change the color and transparency to make it a bit more like a ghost. Next, I went about making the placement zone that would indicate the range in which I could place a turret in relation to my player. And then using a gizmo, I lined up the radius of the circle with the placement distance of the player. And then I wrote the logic to toggle the ring on and off when entering the turret building mode. And finally, I'm up to actually spawning in a turret. And so what happens is when I press the 1 key, it opens up this turret placement mode using the ghost turret prefab that I built earlier. And then when I click somewhere in the placement zone, it instantiates or spawns in the actual tower prefab using a raycast to identify where my mouse is clicked. Obviously, there were some bugs to work through. My towers were spawning in the ground, my mouse position wasn't properly being recognized because I disable it in-game and re-enable it in a menu, and because of that I couldn't move the tower unless I hit escape, and then the tower wasn't spawning in on the mouse position when I clicked. But with some prefab adjustment and then some fixing the cursor locking/unlocking and enabling cursor visibility, it solved the turret placement position and cursor control when building. Then some smaller fixes like my player attacking when placing a tower, and there we have it, our functional tower placement system. Obviously, there is still a load of bugs to fix. My player still turns when I'm in the build menu. I'll need to update the enemy pathing logic when towers block the enemy's path. My code is looking real spaghetti-like as I've had a lot of issues getting the player to stop attacking when it wasn't supposed to, so I've ended up routing a lot of the functionality through the player controller script. Ideally, I'd want to implement a state machine that would have both the tower placement functions and then just plain old player movement, but with all the trouble I've had with state machines lately, I think I might just hold that off for a little bit. But yeah, overall, I think it's coming along pretty nicely. In terms of future things that I'd like to add, a new turret, maybe one that throws a bomb and then leaves like a fire pool or something on the ground that burns enemies when they walk over. I'm also unsure how I'd have to fix my code to add multiple towers. It's pretty messy at the moment, so I know that's going to be a massive project in itself, but I'm keen to kind of get working on cleaning that up. I think fixing the pathing so that enemies will walk around objects I place in the world rather than getting sent back to the Shadow Realm. Imagine this as well is going to be very convoluted and very painful. A new enemy type, maybe like a tank or something that targets towers specifically. I'd like to dabble with multiple spawners and fix the wave spawning system. I kind of broke it when I was implementing my new enemy type. I really don't know where to go with that, but we'll see how it goes. I like to rework the map and make it look a bit more like a map. Maybe add some verticality to it. Maybe add an economy system. There's a lot there, definitely too much for just one video. But yeah, that's probably the main stuff that I want to add. I think I plan to go back to more video game related stuff for the time being. But yeah, I'm glad that I'm seeing some progress, and it's definitely the furthest I've gotten in game development so far, so hopefully I keep at it. Anyway, thanks for stopping by, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.